Cold air slid down the holler like a living thing, carrying the smell of wet leaves and old smoke, the kind that settles into wood and never leaves. Lantern light trembled against a sagging porch rail as the house came into view, quiet, waiting keeper of what some still call Appalachia's darkest secret. It sat apart from the road, far enough that headlights never lingered, close enough that you could hear a screen door creak when no one touched it. Folks said the land didn't like prayers, that hymns thinned out before they reached the rafters. Even the dogs kept their distance, pacing the tree-line with low, uneasy whines. Inside, floorboards remembered footsteps better than names. Walls held breath. A chill lived there year-round, not from weather, but from years of things said too softly or not at all. Imagine standing on that porch at dusk, the hills closing in, knowing the local church once turned its back on this place. No blessing, no water, just silence. Some houses age. This one watched. And long after the lantern went dark, something in that hollow stayed awake. If you feel that hush settle in your chest, you're not alone. Stories like this tend to linger, especially when they're shared quietly. If you find yourself leaning closer, consider liking the video, subscribing to BlackRidge Files, or sharing it with someone who listens the way you do. And tell me, where are you watching from? Trust me, what comes next stays with you. The house didn't announce itself. You could drive past it a dozen times and never quite notice. Just another shape tucked into the bend of the road, another tired roofline pressed low against the hills. But once you knew where to look, it was impossible to unsee. It sat back from the gravel, not hidden exactly, just uninterested in being found. The porch leaned a little toward the earth, as if listening. One shutter hung loose, tapping softly whenever the wind slipped down the hollow. People around there didn't give it a proper name. Names give things permission. They just called it that place, usually with a pause beforehand, eyes flicking somewhere else. If someone new asked who lived there, the answer came thin and careful. Used to be a family. Or, ain't nobody now. No details. No follow-up. It wasn't fear in the loud sense. No screaming warnings, no cross signs. It was something quieter. The kind of unease that settles into routine. Kids were told not to cut through that patch of woods. Hunters skipped that ridge even when game was thick. And on Sundays, when bells carried across the valley, their sound seemed to fade before reaching the house, like the air itself swallowed it. The boards were gray with age, smoothed down by decades of weather. Windows stared out dark, not broken, just unlit. Curtains still hung inside, sun-bleached and unmoving. From the outside, nothing looked wrong enough to justify the way people avoided it. That was the trouble. There was no single moment you could point to and say, that's when it went bad. Old-timers remembered when it wasn't like this. When smoke rose steady from the chimney. When a woman swept the porch every morning, same time, same strokes. When a man's boots thudded on those steps at dawn, heading out before the light reached the creek. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. And then, slowly, the ordinary began to thin out. Church was the spine of the valley. No matter how far apart folks lived, Sunday pulled them together. Baptisms in cold water. Weddings under borrowed flowers. Funerals where grief and faith shared the same bench. Blessings weren't just ceremony. They were protection, a way of saying a place belonged to the living. That's why people noticed when the preacher stopped mentioning the house. At first, it was subtle. A skipped visit. A postponed prayer. Someone asked when the family might have their home blessed, and the answer came sideways. Not yet. Weeks passed. Then months. The house stayed off the list, like a sentence left unfinished. Neighbors told themselves it wasn't their business. Everyone has their reasons. Still, talk travels easy in small places. Someone said the family had asked and been turned away. Someone else said they never asked at all. A woman who sat 3 pews back swore she saw the preacher's hands shaking the day the address was brought up. What stuck wasn't the rumor, it was the absence. No minister on the porch. No him drifting through open windows. No chalk mark. No whispered prayer over the doorframe. In a place where faith stitched everything together, that kind of omission felt deliberate. And the house seemed to notice. The yard grew wild, grass bending whichever way the wind told it to. The path to the door softened, footprints disappearing faster than they should. At night, a single light sometimes glowed in the back room, faint and steady, long after the rest of the valley went dark. No one could say who was awake in there, or why. People passed by with their eyes forward, steps quickened without thinking. Not because they believed in curses or devils, not exactly. It was simpler than that. The house had slipped out of the shared rules, untouched by prayer, unclaimed by blessing, left to hold whatever it had been keeping quiet. And once a place learns it can exist without witness, it changes. Sunday mornings in the valley followed a rhythm older than memory. Dew on the grass, coffee boiled too long on the stove, doors shut with a soft finality that said we'll be back soon. Even folks who didn't believe much still showed up, because belief wasn't always the point. Belonging was. The church sat on a rise, white paint peeling in long strips, windows thrown open when the weather allowed. Bells weren't fancy, just iron and rope, but their sound traveled, rolling over fields and folding into the hills. You could hear them from the creek bottom, from the far barns, from nearly everywhere. Nearly. There was a spot on the road where the ringing weakened, thinned out like breath in cold air. If you stood there long enough, you could tell yourself it was the wind or the way sound bends around land. But those who noticed never stood there twice. It was too close to the house. Inside the church, the pews creaked in familiar places. People sat where their parents had sat, and their parents before them. When prayers were spoken, they covered everything. Sick children, failed crops, men who drank too much, women who prayed too hard. Houses were named, too. Bless the Johnson place. Watch over the Miller farm. The words settled like dust, invisible but assumed to matter. The unspoken gap grew louder each week. One address never crossed the preacher's lips. The absence pulled at the room, a missing note in a hymn everyone knew by heart. It wasn't that the preacher lacked courage. He'd buried children and stood between feuding families with nothing but a Bible and his voice. But when asked, quietly, always quietly, about blessing the house by the bend, his answers drifted. The time ain't right. Some places need waiting. Once, to a man he trusted, he said only, I won't bring the Lord into something I don't understand. That sentence traveled farther than any bell. People began to reframe their memories. A slammed door remembered as a shout. A family argument retold with sharper edges. Small things, reshaped by the knowledge that the church had drawn a line. Faith has a way of doing that, of turning uncertainty into structure. The family still came to town, though less often. When they did, conversations paused, then resumed too quickly. No one was rude. That would have been easier. Instead, there was politeness stretched thin, like fabric about to tear. The children kept close to each other. The mother's eyes stayed forward. The father nodded, once, to anyone who met his gaze that on Sundays, their pew stayed empty. A woman who cleaned the church swore the air felt heavier those mornings, like the building was holding something back. She'd stop mid-sweep, listening, though she never said what for. Others noticed the preacher praying longer after service, alone at the altar, hands pressed flat, as if steadying himself. No one accused the house of being evil. That would have demanded proof. Instead, they treated it as unresolved, unfinished, a place the usual words couldn't quite reach. And in a valley where words were how people kept the dark at bay, that kind of silence felt dangerous. The family had a way of moving through town without leaving much behind. Not unfriendly, just careful. You might see them at the feed store, the mother counting bills twice before handing them over, the father lifting sacks with a quiet efficiency that suggested he didn't want help. The children stayed close, always within reach of a sleeve or a hand, eyes trained on the floor like they were reading something written there. No one could agree on when they first arrived. Time works differently in the hills. Things just are until they aren't. Some said the house had been in the family for generations, passed down the way land often is, without ceremony, without records that mattered. Others insisted they came from one valley over, carrying their past with them like a closed trunk. What people did agree on was how little they spoke about themselves. Names were exchanged, yes. Pleasantries observed. But the talk never drifted toward stories. No mention of kin. No laughter that carried. When asked about church, the mother smiled politely and said they prayed at home. That answer settled wrong, like a stone in the shoe. The children were the hardest to place. Not wild, not neglected. Clean enough. Federal. But there was something in how they listened. Heads tilted slightly, as if waiting for a sound others couldn't hear. At school, they learned quickly but rarely raised their hands. When called on, they answered plainly, without embellishment, and sat back down as if relief came with silence. Neighbors noticed patterns before they noticed problems. The curtains closed before dusk, every night, same time. Lamps extinguished in a careful order. The back door bolted even in summer. No visitors. No kin stopping by. Birthdays passed unmarked. When sickness went through the valley, their house remained untouched, or at least, no one heard of illness crossing that threshold. A woman who lived down the road once brought over a casserole, the kind that traveled well and asked no questions. She knocked twice. Waited. From inside, she heard movement, slow, deliberate, but the door never opened. She left the dish on the step, feeling foolish, and returned the next day to find it gone. Clean, placed neatly to the side, like a borrowed thing returned without thanks. The father worked when work was available. He paid in cash. He didn't linger. Once, someone joked about the preacher coming by to bless the place, trying to lighten the air. The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ain't everything needs that," he said, and the conversation folded in on itself. At night, lights sometimes burned late in the back room. Not bright, just enough to mark presence. Children were heard then, their voices low, words indistinct. Not arguing, not singing, just murmuring. Those passing by felt a pull to listen harder, then a stronger urge to keep walking. No one saw violence. No one heard screams. That was the trouble. There was nothing concrete to hold on to, only a sense of distance growing wider with every polite exchange. In the mountains, isolation isn't always physical. Sometimes it's chosen, built piece by piece, until a family stands just far enough outside the circle that when something shifts, when something goes wrong, there's no easy way back in. The first thing people noticed wasn't a sound. It was a change in how the quiet behaved. Nights grew thicker around the house, like the dark had weight to it. Crickets still sang, owls still called, but their rhythms felt interrupted, as if something else had learned the timing and stepped in between. Folks walking home after sundown quickened their pace without meaning to, keys clenched tight, breath held until the bend in the road was behind them. A boy swore he heard footsteps pacing the porch long after midnight. Slow, measured, too steady to be an animal. His father told him it was the boards settling, that old houses do that. Still, the boy stopped cutting through that way. Then came the smells. Wood smoke when no fire should have been burning. Something sharp, almost medicinal, drifting out on cold evenings. A woman hanging laundry paused once, nose wrinkling, and said it reminded her of the church basement after funerals. She didn't finish the thought. The preacher began waking in the night. He never said why, just that sleep came lighter now. He'd sit at the kitchen table until dawn, Bible open but unread, listening to the hills breathe. His wife noticed him avoiding the road by the house, adding time to his visits without explanation. Small incidents stacked quietly, the way worry does. A chicken coop left open, birds untouched but scattered. A mule refusing to pass the driveway, hooves planted, eyes white-rimmed. A hunter finding his compass spinning uselessly near the tree lean. Then steadying the moment, he stepped back. None of it proved anything. That's what made it worse. One evening, during a revival service meant to strengthen faith, the power cut out mid-hymn. Lanterns were lit, voices wavered, then steadied. As the preacher prayed, a distant thud echoed through the valley. Once, twice. Too far to place, too heavy to ignore. When the lights returned, no one spoke about it, but several eyes drifted toward the same window. The family stopped coming to town altogether after that. No trips for feed. No mail collected. Weeks passed. The yard grew higher. The path to the door vanished beneath leaves. A man finally worked up the nerve to check on them, more out of obligation than concern. He walked up to the porch, called out. No answer. The door was locked. Windows dark. He swore the air felt colder there, even in afternoon sun. He left without knocking again. That night, the backroom light burned brighter than anyone remembered seeing it before. Whatever the house held, whatever it had learned to keep, no longer felt contained. And the valley, for the first time, seemed aware it had been watching something gather strength in silence. The preacher had been called many things over the years: steady, patient, a man who didn't rush the Lord, but never cowardly. Still, that word followed him now, unspoken but present. He felt it when hands lingered too long after service, when eyes searched his face for answers he wouldn't give. Refusing to bless a house was no small thing. It wasn't written anywhere, but everyone knew it crossed an invisible line. He remembered the first time he'd stood at the edge of that yard, Bible tucked under his arm, boots sunk slightly into soft ground. He hadn't planned to stop, hadn't even slowed. But something about the place tugged at him, a pressure behind the eyes, like trying to recall a dream that didn't want remembering. He told himself it was nerves. Too much talk. Too much imagination. Then the door opened. The father stood there, filling the frame, face unreadable. They spoke politely. Weather. Work. The usual shields. But when the preacher glanced past him, just for a moment, he caught sight of the back room. Lamps burning though the sun was high. Curtains drawn tight. And the children, seated close together, heads bent, mouths moving without sound. He didn't step inside. That night, he dreamed of standing at the altar, water in his hands. Only it slipped through his fingers before he could lift it. He woke with his heart racing, a certainty settling in his chest that frightened him more than doubt ever had. People pressed him for reasons. Scripture. Precedent. He gave them none. Some places, he said once, voice low, ain't meant to be named before God until they're ready to be known. It sounded like wisdom. It felt like fear. His wife watched him grow thinner, quieter. He prayed more, slept less. Once, she found him burning old sermon notes in the stove, pages curling black before they could be read again. When she asked why, he only said, words matter, even after they're spoken. The valley began to split, not openly, but along subtle lines. Some believed the preacher was protecting them, holding something back for their own good. Others whispered that he'd already failed them, that whatever was brewing had been given space by his silence. Late one afternoon, he walked the long way home and found himself near the house again, though he couldn't say why. The yard was overgrown now, the porch sagging further than before. He stood at the edge of it, Bible heavy in his hands. He thought of stepping forward, of speaking the words anyway, of forcing light where it wasn't welcome. Instead, he turned away. Years later, when asked why the church refused that blessing, he would say only this: because sometimes a door ain't locked to keep evil out. Sometimes it's locked to keep it in. The hills don't forget. Every ridge, every creek bend, holds memory in a way that towns and roads can't. And the hollow where the house stood seemed to remember more than anyone wanted. Trees leaned closer, as if listening. Moss draped over rocks in patterns no one noticed consciously, but subconsciously, it told a story of decades unbroken. Footfalls softened against the undergrowth. The wind carried voices that weren't there, subtle, indistinct, like echoes brushing the eaves. The valley soil had been pressed by the family's presence for years. Gardens tilled, paths walked, children running barefoot through the mud. Even after the family disappeared from public view, the hills remembered. They remembered laughter that didn't quite reach eyes, the hush that fell over rooms, and the quiet diligence that marked each day. Nature, patient as always, began to fold itself around the house, reclaiming where human hands had once shaped. Animals seemed to sense it too. Dogs avoided the driveway. A single hawk circled overhead, unblinking, silent, never straying too far. Even the creek whispered differently near the property, carrying a tone sharper, almost deliberate, than the distant bubbling elsewhere. Locals felt it enough to walk the other way without naming why. Generational silence had layered over the land like a fog. The families who had known the household before it became untouchable, unblessed, had passed away, leaving fragments of stories that were never quite complete. Tales twisted in retelling. The mother who never laughed freely, the father who carried too much weight in his silence, the children who seemed to hear things no one else did. All anchored to the earth, all stitched into the landscape. Hikers or travelers occasionally passed nearby, sensing only the ordinary at first. Then, in the stillness, the familiar smells, wood smoke, faint medicinal hints, wet earth rose to prick awareness. A sense that the land itself was alert, watching, recalling. The hills held a patient kind of judgment, neutral, yet undeniable. They bore witness to the choices, the refusals, the isolation. Even the wind seemed to navigate cautiously. It carried the echoes of prayers never spoken, of hymns never sung, of doors never opened to welcome blessing. And in that quiet orchestration of nature, the hollow waited. Waiting, perhaps, not for intrusion, not for rescue, but for acknowledgement that it existed on its own terms. That the hills would remember even if no one else could. Every time someone drove past, glanced up, and felt the pull of unspoken stories, the hollow reminded them. Some histories do not bend to human expectation. Some houses, some lands, simply endure, keeping the past alive in ways words cannot capture. The night came down like a heavy curtain, settling over the hollow with a deliberate slowness. Stars were obscured by low-hanging clouds, and the wind carried a damp chill that seeped through even the thickest coats. The house, as if aware of the approaching darkness, seemed to draw inward, shadows pooling in the corners of the porch and under the eaves. Floorboards groaned under the weight of the unseen, stretching the silence in ways that made the heart quicken. Neighbors said they heard a commotion that evening, though few could place the source. A series of sharp thuds, quick and then dragging, echoed through the hills. Dogs barked erratically, then fell silent. The preacher, returning from a late visit elsewhere in the valley, slowed when he neared the bend. He felt it immediately, the kind of silence that wasn't absence, but presence. Something was holding itself in place, waiting, patient and alert. Inside, lights flickered in the back room, shadows bending and twisting as though the walls themselves had grown restless. No one had entered, yet movement persisted. Curtains shifted as though brushed by invisible hands. The children, normally silent, murmured in low tones, words indistinct but rhythmic, almost like a chant. Even the father's steps, measured and deliberate, failed to settle the space. The house had become an organism, breathing in sync with its occupants, yet stretching beyond them. Outside, the valley held its breath. Folks who lived down the road claimed they could feel the vibration of that night in their own homes, as if the hills carried the tension like a hidden current. Lanterns on porches swung without wind, and smoke from chimneys twisted unnaturally, curling in directions that defied gravity. Even the creek seemed to pause, water slowing its course as if honoring some unseen rule. By dawn, the house had gone still, but the air remained charged, thick with residue of the night's unrest. Neighbors walked past, speaking in whispers, noting the faint glow of the backroom light, now unbroken and steady, holding vigil long after the activity had ceased. It was a night remembered not for what anyone saw, but for what was sensed, the kind of event that lingers, defies explanation, and leaves a valley changed in subtle ways. No one claimed to understand fully what happened, but the story passed through quiet corners of the town, whispered over fences and across porches. It became another layer of the house's history, the night the hollow went still, yet remained awake. A night when the ordinary world intruded on nothing, and the house held on to its secrets with more determination than ever. Years had passed, yet the house remained. Time treated it differently than it did other buildings in the valley. Rooflines sagged, paint peeled, boards warped, but nothing crumbled entirely. It stood as if the land itself was protecting it, sheltering whatever had been kept inside, guarding stories the town dared only hint at. People came and went, but few lingered. The path to the door was overgrown, yet unmistakable, a quiet invitation that most chose to ignore. Inside, the family's presence had faded but not disappeared. Furniture settled into corners as though arranged by memory rather than hands. Dust layered slowly, tracing the edges of footprints that once mattered. The backroom light, the faint, steady glow, was gone, but the sense of eyes watching, listening, remained. The house had learned to carry its own history, a weight independent of anyone who entered or left. Even the hills seemed to lean closer, murmuring reminders of what had been and what must never be spoken aloud. Folks in the valley continued their routines. Children grew, farms expanded or shrank, and sermons carried the same weight they always had. But whenever someone passed the bend in the road, a chill would rise from the earth, and they would remember. Some houses aren't meant for casual attention. Some dwellings outlast curiosity, outlast explanation. The church's refusal had been more than ritual, it had been acknowledgement. Certain things cannot be folded into ordinary life without consequence. People still whispered about the house. They told stories that wavered between caution and fascination. No one went to knock on the door, but those who looked through the trees swore they felt the place watching back. A woman driving home late at night claimed she saw movement in the upper windows, though no one had lived there for decades. A hunter reported hearing low murmurs behind the walls, steady as a heartbeat, even when he was alone. And the preacher, now older, quieter, yet sharper in memory, still avoided that bend, Bible tucked close, acknowledging something unspoken but enduring. The house remained unblessed, unclaimed, untamed. It became legend not through violence, not through spectacle, but through silence, through absence, through the subtle insistence that some stories are kept not by people, but by the earth itself. Visitors, curious or foolish, learned quickly that the house had rules of its own. It allowed observation, but never intrusion. It carried a memory of those who had lived there, of prayers withheld, of nights thick with tension. And it waited, still, for no one in particular, holding its secret like a breath beneath the hills. The valley moves on, as it always does. But the house remains, still standing, still unblessed, still whispering, reminding everyone that some histories, some places, simply refuse to be folded into ordinary life. And if you ever find yourself near that bend, pause. Listen, the house remembers. And maybe, just maybe, it will let you hear what the hills have carried for decades.